Don't let the bedbugs bite. My business partner, Aaron, and I arrived at the dark cottage late at night, soaked to the bone from the torrential rain. The sign outside read, "Rooms available." We were weary, and this should have been a good omen. Yet the silhouette cut around the house by the full moon's light left me unsettled. "I know about this," I said. "We've been traveling for hours, and I'm beat," Aaron said. "I don't think we have a choice." "The lights are out," I said. "We shouldn't bother." But before I could finish speaking, the attic window lit up. A woman's shadow moved briskly across it before the light was again extinguished. A moment passed, then the house lit up like a Christmas tree. We shielded our eyes from the blinding floodlights that bathed us. "Your boys better come out the rain now, before you get a cold." We heard a friendly voice shout through the flood of rain and light. We hitched our horses to the post out front and hustled onto the porch. A short, older woman with a beaming smile met us. "Now, what are a couple of fancy boys like you gawking at our home in the rain like that?" she said. "Don't you know you'll give people the creeps?" I felt embarrassed. I realized I'd been reading the news too much and was getting paranoid. "We're sorry, ma'am," I said. "We're looking for a couple of rooms." "That won't be a problem. You gentlemen are our first customers in quite some time," she said, smiling. "We are just so glad to have you here." We walked into the musty foray and set our bags down. It felt like we were standing in an antique store. Plastic covered the furniture and everything seemed ancient. The grandfather clock chimed that it was midnight. "Let me fix you something to eat," the woman said. She turned and walked towards the kitchen in the back of the house. "I'm beat," I said. "I'd rather you just show us to our room." "Let me fix you something to eat," the woman said with overwhelming seriousness. In the intervening silence, the unsettling feeling returned to me. Every fibre of my body wanted to flee. But then she spun around and smiled at us once again. "Can't let you go to bed hungry. What kind of host would I be?" she said cheerily. We glanced at one another nervously, but eventually relented and followed her into the kitchen. The woman babbled while she reheated dinner from earlier that night. She regaled us with overly complicated anecdotes about people we would never know in the nearby town. Her odd mannerisms and sputtering sent us further on edge. Finally, she set down 2 big plates of sauce over rice and mysterious chunks of meat. It smelled delightful. "May I ask what this is?" I said. "You ain't never had gumbo before?" she screamed. "Well, it's rice, gravy, sausage, and, well, we call them mudbugs. Dig in." With that, she left the room. I'd eaten crawfish before, but the meat looked nothing like that. Nevertheless, it was delicious, even though we gulped it down so quickly that we could hardly taste it. As we finished our plates, the woman returned. "Your rooms are ready now," he said. "Let me show you." We walked up the creaky old steps with my bag. At the doorway, the woman said, "Don't let the bedbugs bite." I smiled and thanked her, but she grabbed my sleeve and stared at me intensely. "I'm serious. Don't let the bedbugs bite." I shook her off and stumbled backwards into my room. She shut the door in my face. I had horrible nightmares and couldn't stay asleep that night. Luckily, being in business with your friend means sharing drugs as needed. So I'd give him some uppers here and there when he was dragging, and he would give me downers when I needed to relax. Tonight was one of the nights when I needed to rest. I stepped onto the cold hardwoods and slunk down the creaky hallway to Aaron's room. At first, I thought the strange noises emanating from his room were from a sound machine, but I realized it was far too loud. I put my ear against the door, and the chirping, clicking, and squishing were so loud that it vibrated. The moonlight illuminated Aaron's bed as I entered. His comforter writhed like a rocky ocean, and the chirping was deafening. It smelled like burnt hair and sewage. I yanked the blanket off the bed, and underneath were thousands of cockroach-like creatures with vicious pincers tearing into my friend's desiccated flesh. They'd removed his skin, and now only a bloody husk with a gaping, toothless mouth remained. The sea of bugs squirmed, and as they finished their feast, turned on one another and tore each other apart. A sharp whistle cut through the air. "That's enough, boys." The bugs stopped fighting and lay still. I turned to find the old woman, flashing a malicious grin at me from the doorway. "The mud bugs gotta eat something," the woman croaked. "I told you not to let them bite." Knock, knock. Can you believe that every person eats an average of 8 spiders in their sleep each year? Knock, knock. Franz was laying on a shag carpet on the floor of his apartment, twisting the dark orange, thread-like fibers between his fingers and listening to a podcast about bugs. Normally, he wouldn't show this much affection to his rug, but considering he was filled to the brim with MDMA and LSD, he was feeling a bit randy. The knock on his door interrupted his liaison with the carpet. Its faint, tepid tenor disturbed him. He fixed his gaze on the door. Franz whispered quietly to himself. Maybe they'll go away. Knock, knock, knock. Shit, okay, Franz mumbled. He wheezed as he stood up and paused the podcast playing from his phone. After he undid the deadbolt but not the chain lock, his grossly dilated pupils peered through the crack in the door. "Hello?" Franz asked. Only the sound of plodding raindrops responded from the menacing void. Paranoia loomed large as his eyes darted from the empty pathway to the moths fluttering around the dull, yellow porch light, and then back to the leering darkness. Knock, scratch, knock, scratch, knock. This time, the pounding had a raspiness to it. It was like the sound of a dog pitifully pawing at a door. But there was no dog. His drug-addled mind led him back inside and onto his comfy lime green beanbag. He started deep breathing exercises and was soon relaxed by the idea the sounds were more than likely an auditory hallucination. He smiled and had a good laugh at his own expense. Knock, scratch, knock, scratch, knock. His eyes shot open and he scrambled to his feet as his fight or flight response kicked in. Although, he didn't know where to flee or who to fight. He frantically ran his hands over and over his balding head while pacing back and forth. His gaze returned to the door. What the fuck? Okay. Just think. Just click, knock, scratch, knock, click. The faint clicking was overlaid with harsh clawing, like nails on concrete. Through the primordial combination of fear and drugs, he upended the apartment like an animal. Behind every door, cabinet, and picture frame, he triple-checked for his mysterious terrorizer, to no avail. He retrieved a stethoscope from a doctor-themed Halloween costume that he'd worn last October, as if being unable to hear the knocking was the problem, and started listening intently to the walls. When there was a spot where he imagined the knocking was particularly loud or abrasive, he bashed it open with a claw hammer. An hour later, Franz sat on his beanbag feeling defeated and surrounded by dusty white rubble from the drywall. Thankfully, there were no neighbours left in his building to disturb. Everyone else had temporarily moved out of the apartment building so they could spray for bugs. Franz had decided to stay in order to receive a $400 credit towards his next rent payment. The free money was nice, but more importantly, Franz had never seen a bug in his apartment. Not a single one since he moved in. He used to feel pretty lucky because of that. Knock, scratch, knock, scratch, knock, knock, scratch, knock, scratch, knock. As his body sank further into his beanbag, he felt increasingly unlucky. The search history on his phone included these: tinnitus, harsh scratching, tinnitus, knocking. Are there other forms of tinnitus besides a ringing sound? And tinnitus cure? He soon resigned himself once again to the belief that it had to be an exceptionally caustic auditory hallucination. However, this resignation didn't allow him to sleep peacefully. A handful of Ambien were laid out in the shape of a smiling face before he swallowed all 6, one by one. The sleep was long, steady and uninterrupted, like death. Knock, scratch, squirm, knock, click, scratch, knock, squirm, scratch, click, knock. His eyelids opened. The knocking was deafening, and then morphed into a slimy, dragging sound. Then his bed started moving beneath him, or more accurately, he started squirming. A writhing blanket of spiders, worms, cockroaches, millipedes, termites, cicadas, grasshoppers, and beetles slowly began engulfing him from below. It was as if they were waiting for him to wake up. He felt their little legs dragging, squirming, and clawing over every inch of his skin. The stomach-churning smell of crushed bugs filled his nostrils. He opened his mouth to scream, but the cockroach quickly fluttered in to fill the void. He spat it out and shot out of bed. The floor underneath his bare feet crunched as he looked down and saw that the floor of his apartment was also covered in an assortment of insects. His mind was too terrified to make sense of the situation, so he ran to the bathroom to clean himself. Click, knock, scratch, squirm, knock, scratch, click, knock, scratch, knock, squirm, scratch, knock. This time there was no mistaking the source of the sounds. They were coming from inside of his own head. A sharp pain in his left ear caused him to wince. With the right side of his head turned towards the mirror, he examined the shaded ear canal. A small pair of antennae peeped from the hole before the rest of the cockroach scurried out. Instead of screams, a torrent of bugs streamed from his gaping mouth. His fingernails scraped against his scalp as he wallowed in helpless terror. One by one, his eyeballs popped out with a splat when they landed on a tangled ball of worms. Out of the 2 new holes in his head, more bugs flowed. Franz's body started to morph and shrink as if he was deflating. The colour of his skin turned to a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The bugs flowed like water and Franz continued to collapse until he was nothing but a pile of hollow skin. Several months later, when the landlord eventually came to evict Franz for not paying his rent, he was sick. The thick blanket of bugs had seemingly grown and multiplied into a wriggling, waist-high sea. Bugs spilled onto the doorstep before the landlord shut the door. It was never opened again. When the apartment building was condemned and burned a few weeks later, the bugs scurried away to find a new home. Franz's skin suit, whose warped, pus-coloured face was frozen with an aghast look, melted into a rotten puddle.